Good morning, everybody. Good to see you. We're going to continue our series in Abraham, the faith of Abraham, called Following On, Stepping Out in Faith. And this is the third of the series we're doing, and this one is Active Faith. Abraham's a good example for us to learn from. He's a man who's struggling to know God, and in that struggle we see his faith go up and down. But one thing we all should realise is that if we have faith in God, then that should affect the way we live and the decisions we make. And we've already seen in these first two parts of the story that faith grows and then faith wavers. And this is the same for the whole of Abraham's life. We're going to look at chapter 14 in a minute, but let me just recap on 13. Abraham and the family have returned from Egypt, richer in what they did when they went into the land. And Abraham and Lot and the tribe continue to grow in abundance. Their flocks and herds grow, and they move from one place to the other, constantly in need of fresh pasture. But Lot's part of the tribe and Abram's part of the tribe start to fight over the water, and this causes great concern. And so Abraham challenges Lot about this, and Lot says quite bluntly in chapter 13, look, there isn't enough room in this land for both of us to live side by side. I suggest we split up. And Abraham makes a wise decision and says, well, okay, well, which way do you want to go? We've got to move on from this pasture where we are. So which way you choose? And Lot chooses to go and live near the cities. And that turns out to be a bad decision. Abraham goes in the opposite direction and is continually blessed by God. His faith grows and his wealth increases. And now we come up to chapter 14. There were many kings reigning in Canaan at the time of Abraham, ruling over cities and towns. And peace ruled for many years, but then suddenly peace broke down and all these kings started fighting each other. The fighting spread towards Sodom and Gomorrah, and Lot gets mixed up in this, captured and enslaved. Abraham hears this and goes after him. At night, Abram divided up his troops, attacked from all sides, and won a great victory. But some of the enemy escaped to a town of Hobah, north of Damascus. Abram went after them. He brought back his nephew Lot, together with Lot's possessions and the women and everyone else who had been captured. Active faith. The question, we've heard the story of how Lot causes trouble, not just amongst his fellow family, but he got mixed up in other squabbles with these kings. Now, when we look at these kings, these aren't big kingdoms. These are small leaders of tribes, like Abraham, really. They're not big, they're not massive. Perhaps the king of Sodom, of a reasonably sized city, has got something and the land around it, but they're not big kings with big armies. You know, it's sort of tribal warfare there. But this is the story that we're into after Abraham's trying to settle in the land. And from reading of the text, I don't think Abraham was much pleased with Lot as he takes off. And he warns him that cities are not good for our people. We are tent dwellers. The question we should address at this juncture really, is Lot an obstacle to Abraham? Remember, Lot volunteered to come with Abraham when they set off. Abraham was quite happy to set off with just his family. And I suppose he had some sense of responsibility, because Lot's father, Abraham's elder brother, died, and Lot looked towards Abraham for guidance. But of course now he's a grown man, and is in charge of his tribe, his extended family with servants and everything else. I mean, there's no suggestion in the text that Abraham was disobedient by letting Lot come along, but we have to wonder if having Lot there altered Abraham's perspective and made difference to the decisions he makes. We have no idea or no suggestion that Lot also is seeking to worship the one true God, or is he still worshipping idols like the rest of his family? So that's something to ponder as we get into this story, because in many ways God gives us all opportunities to follow him and receive his blessing, but that depends on the decisions we make. And I suspect, like me, you've often perhaps thought God's calling you to do something or other, or go in one direction or another, or do something, some kind of service or another, and you haven't followed through on that. And that's been a hindrance to your relationship with God. In many respects, if we keep a close relationship to God, when God gives us a calling or a direction or some sense of a way we should follow him or serve him, we should take that opportunity and step out in faith. Often we don't. Often, I'm sure, I didn't when God first called me. It may take 2 or 3 times. In many ways, we need to seize the opportunity. One of the best films I think Robin Williams ever made was Dead Poets Society. Anybody seen this film? I think it's a great film. Got his humour, but it tackles a serious question. The character of Robin Williams is a schoolmaster, and he's gone back to the school where he went, a private school that's rich on tradition in early 19th century America. And he is a poet, and he wants to encourage his class, he teaches English literature, to really get into poetry. And this is the first opportunity when he comes into the classroom on the first day of term. So, very interesting film. But there's this new teacher who's come in to teach English literature to these boys in a very austere, I suppose we would call it, school. And he's a bit different from most other teachers. He's got a real interest in boys' lives, and he's trying to convince them as they come into his class to seize the opportunity of learning. And as well as learning Latin and everything else in a school, you can learn much from the poetry of the past. And that's very much like our situation with the story of Abraham. We see him too go through difficult events, but when he seizes the opportunity, then great things happen. Abraham gave up the chance of taking the best grazing land to Lot when he gained the whole land. David gave up the chance of the crown when it was first offered to him, but eventually he gained a crown and a name that would live forever. Jesus gave up the chance when the devil offered him all the kingdoms of this world to gain the holy kingdom and enrich all our lives. Previously, in chapters up to chapter 13 and especially 12, Abraham had cowered in the face of difficulty. He ran away from God's promises when he entered Egypt. I'm pretty sure that God never called him into the land of Canaan, and within a few weeks let him starve because of a famine. God would have shown him the way, but he bottled it and ran off to Egypt and almost ran into catastrophe, but God rescues him. So we come to the story in Genesis 14, and here we see a different side of Abraham. Instead of fleeing from danger when there's war breaks out amongst the various kings of the land of Canaan, he doesn't run away. He takes the opportunity of sorting it out. Just him and his 300 men. And in the promises, he rescues Lot from certain slavery. And yet Lot, again, doesn't take the opportunity to walk with God. So Abraham is living south of the Sea of Galilee, and he chases these kings when he hears that Lot's been captured, right up to Damascus, through the whole land of Canaan. We don't know much about these kings at all. Research and archaeological evidence doesn't turn up much about these kings. They're not, to be honest, I don't think, very important. They were leaders of clans who sometimes got on together and worked together, fought wars together, and then fell out. But we do know that Abraham was to come in and step up to the leadership of Canaan that God had called him to. Lot's greedy nature had got him into trouble. In contrast, Abraham's growing faith led him to be full of courage and be prepared and know what opportunities to take. We can learn a lot in general from this battle and others in the Old Testament. I don't know about you, but sometimes I get worried about all these battles in the Old Testament and how gruesome they are. But what is God saying through these battles? Well, I think he's saying a couple of things. First, that Israel, his people that he's beginning to draw together, would learn that they are his chosen people. And he will give them victories over their enemies when the need arose. Israel was plagued with enemies in the early days from other tribes in the regions trying to take over the rich lands of Palestine. And so Abraham must learn this. Israel, the Hebrew people, must learn that if they follow God, live within his laws that he later gives them, he will give them victory over their enemies in the promised land, and the promised land will be secure. Secondly, we must know that in the Old Testament, warfare was actual and physical, but it was also spiritually significant in the people's relationship to God. And when we get on to the New Testament, we learn that the battles Christians fight are the battles of spirituality. According to the New Testament, a Christian's battle and weapons are spiritual, and God's promises are eternal. And this is what Abraham was beginning to learn, and his people and his ancestors too would need to learn this. Using military figures of speech, Paul often portrayed Christ's death, didn't he, as a victory over evil. Sin was conquered. Death was conquered. We often use battle words, war words, to talk about Christian battles. Christ's gifts to us were spiritual for us to use. And with spiritual gifts, we can be ready armed for all the battles that are ahead of us through this life. So that's what we got to remember through this warfare in antiquity. Abraham musters his 318 trained men and goes north, following Lot and his family. He actually followed them for about 140 miles. That was no mean feat in that day before he recaptured Lot's family and his possession. It was a striking victory for Abraham over 4 leading kings of the district. So he proceeds after these people, captures them, and in the peace treaty he's noted as a leader and a clan leader and a Hebrew. And as he returns towards his dwelling place in the south of Canaan to join up with the rest of the family, the women and the children that didn't go, he is met by Melchizedek. Melchizedek, this strange person that appears in the Old Testament just in this one instance. Melchizedek, king of Salem. Salem is the first name of Jerusalem, the Mount Moriah, and he announces as the king of righteousness and peace. And Melchizedek is seen in the same vein as Jesus, because Jesus was a priest and a king. Melchizedek blesses Abram and shows that God has begun to make Abraham's name great, and his name will bless others. So this king that's just got a few verses in Genesis is mentioned in the Psalms and in the New Testament. Let's see what he says. Here's one definition from the Dictionary of Biblical Imagery. Melchizedek is one of the mystery figures in the Bible, a character whose evocative splendour is all out of proportion to the brevity of space devoted to him. His story is told in a mere 3 verses after Abraham defeats the kings who carried his nephew Lot into captivity. He is met by Melchizedek, who blesses him, in response to which Abraham offers him a tenth of everything. Who is this shadowy figure who elicits such respect from Abraham and seems to come out of nowhere to play his role on the stage of biblical history? So it's one of those things. He's a man of mystery, but he's also a man who recognises who Abraham is and who God is. If we go back to the text of chapter 14 in verses 18, let's read the words again. King Melchizedek of Salem was a priest of the Most High. He brought out some bread and wine and said to Abram, I bless you in the name of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. All praise belongs to God Most High for helping you defeat your enemies. And then Abraham gives him a tenth. Melchizedek recognises that, but Abraham then gives him a tenth of his wealth there and then. So this is a significant part. At long last, Abraham has met a figure who also knows God most intimately. And as a sign of that, he brings him bread and wine, and they share bread and wine together. That reminds us of communion, doesn't it? Bread and wine. They share it. I would imagine Abraham's heart leapt for joy when he met Melchizedek, because he could speak to him on that same level. A man who knew God. Abraham's faith is grown from nothing. And here God is sending in a person to help him understand that there is a God who is Most High, the creator of heaven and earth. And therefore that will help Abraham to know that he will see all his promises that God makes to him. What a wonderful opportunity when we meet someone who's got the same type of faith as we have. If you've ever been away from home, or been away from the church, family or friends somewhere, either on business or in holiday or something, and then suddenly you meet a fellow Christian who's got, and you share some faith together, perhaps over a drink or something. It's a really heartwarming thing, isn't it? It's something to be full of joy about. Well, this is what happened to Abraham. Let me give another definition here. In Genesis, Melchizedek is an evocative story of mystery and authority, but would we scarcely make much of the figure if it were not for the expansions of the picture later in the Bible. In the Psalms, with messianic overtones, God is pictured as swearing incontrovertibly. Oh dear. Yeah. God. You know what I mean? The words are there. You are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. This would simply enhance the sense of mystery surrounding Melchizedek if it was not for further elaboration in the book of Hebrews. So we'll come to the book of Hebrews in a minute, but Melchizedek's blessing illustrates the beginning of God's fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. Melchizedek's recognition and blessing of Abram shows that God had begun to make Abraham's name great and bless others as a result. So this is a significant part in the life story of Abraham, that Melchizedek comes into his life and blesses him. And this, of course, is recognised. If we go into the book of Hebrews, we see this is what the writer to Hebrews talks about. Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. And to Abraham apportions the 10th part of everything. He is first, by translation of his name, King of Righteousness, and then he is also King of Salem. That is King of Peace. He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of the days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God. He continues as a priest forever. So here's the writer of Hebrews saying Melchizedek, who Abraham met, was like Christ, because there's no beginning or end to the story of Melchizedek. He appears and disappears. We don't know who his ancestry was. He had an ancestry, but that was not known. And so the writer of Hebrews brings this figure into full light in the story of Abraham. And we see in this that this is the beginning of God's blessing through Melchizedek, and God's blessing to us and to other believers of God as well. I'll drop that one. Abraham gave him a tithe. This is another sign of worship, and how Abraham actually recognises the importance of another person who is a God believer, and of course sets the way really for us to know that if we want to bless God, then we should give portions of our wealth to God himself. And of course the other thing to recognise, that Melchizedek was not part of the priestly family. We remember, well, we talked about that last week, didn't we, with the Good Samaritan, when we looked at Sadducees and Pharisees and priests and Levites. They were all part of the tribe of Levi. This was what God gave to Moses as the priestly line. But of course, this is before Moses, and Melchizedek comes to be a priest, as Jesus is our priest. That's partly what's happening in the book of Hebrews, is the teaching that God is not only Jesus is not only our Saviour, but he is the priest. In that, somebody who is the centre of our worship, who helps us to worship the Godhead. So his role in history and doctrine is absolutely massive, Melchizedek, considering the portion of scripture that's given it to him. So although Abraham and Melchizedek were strangers and foreigners to each other, they shared the most important characteristics of both worship and service to the God who made heaven and earth. Right, next week we're on to dealing with down in chapter 15.